Hello and welcome. We are so excited to share with you the Student Upward Mobility Initiative. My name is Karishma Furtado, and I'm a co-principal investigator on SUMI and a senior research associate at the Urban Institute, and I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. You'll get to see and meet more of the team in a few moments, but before we do that, and as people continue to trickle in, let me get some housekeeping out of the way. First, as you may have noticed, this event is being recorded, and that recording will be shared on our website for your benefit and the benefit of those who are unable to join today. Second, if you need or want them, you can turn on and adjust captions using the live transcript button on your screen. Third, additional information about each of today's speakers can be found on the webinar's event page at urban.org. Fourth, as you may have noticed, you're muted. That's because there are a lot of us here, which is wonderful, and we just want to keep things manageable. With that being said, we certainly do want to hear from you, so please do put your questions and comments into the Q&A box, and Emberlyn and others from the SUMI team will work to organize them and ensure that we can get to as many of them as possible in our Q&A section at the end of our time together. And finally, you can engage further with us online using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban, and we'll share some other ways you can be in touch with us as well over the course of our time together. So moving on, I've already welcomed you. I've shared my enthusiasm. I've said my hellos. Let me tell you a little bit more about what we have in store for you today. First, we're going to tell you about the initiative, getting straight to the bottom line, that this is a funding opportunity and we're looking for exciting work to support. From there, we'll tell you a bit more about the initiative's motivation, theory of change, team, and supporters. Next, we'll share about how we're thinking about some of the initiative's foundational concepts related to education and mobility. We'll then move into the specific areas of interest for our 2024 RFP. We will talk about application and how to apply, and we'll close with some next steps and Q&A. With that, let me hand things off to my colleague, Matt Chingos, to tell you more about SUMI.
Thank you, Karishma, and good morning from rainy Washington, D.C. I'm Matt Chingos, Vice President for Education Data and Policy at the Urban Institute and Principal Investigator of the SUMI Initiative. And so just to get started, we're going to give you a lot of information today. Mobility from, for kids from families with low incomes to lifelong success is a long, complicated, thorny problem, and we're going to get into some of that complexity today. So I just wanted to start with kind of a quick preview of some of the highlights of our initiative, focusing on the 2024 RFP, our inaugural RFP. And so some key numbers here: $3 million in total awards is the amount of total grant funding we're expecting to give out through this first RFP. It's going to be through a two-stage application process. A mandatory LOI that will be due on Tuesday, April 30th is the first stage of that process. We also want to provide, we want as many good proposals as possible. This is really a whole process designed to produce good proposals. And so we're giving folks the opportunity to send us a one-paragraph pitch sharing an idea. And if you get that to us by April 10th, then we guarantee we'll get back to you with some feedback. Budget sizes should correspond to the project's likely impact and proposed activities. And we're anticipating budgets between $50,000 and $500,000, and with some indirect rate cap there, as well as looking for projects up to 2 years in duration. So that's kind of some of the brass tacks that we'll get into in more detail later, but we thought to just sort of highlight at the very top so they don't get lost. But now I take a very big step back and talk a little bit about why are we doing this work. So this whole initiative is motivated by this idea that we all know education is so important. But we don't know nearly enough about what pre-K-12 educators and policymakers should prioritize if they want to, as I think almost all of us do, put students on a path towards upward mobility. And just as we know education matters, we know lots of other things matter as well, including many factors, systems, structures beyond the control of students, in many cases, even beyond the control of schools. And we need to understand them so we don't overly individualize what is fundamentally a systems problem. And so the goal of this initiative is to identify a priority set of pre-K-12 measures that forecast upward mobility, measures that educators and policymakers can use to evaluate their efforts, to monitor change, to inform families, to support accountability, to support broader systems change, do a whole lot of different things. And so that's kind of our goal for this initiative. But how are we doing this work? How is this initiative going to move us towards this goal? Well, there's a couple of key strategies. One is that we're going to be funding new R&D through things like our 2024 RFP. But we're not stopping there. We're also going to take what the field learns through that research that we fund, as well as other research that may be happening at the same time. We're going to take it back to the team at Urban, and we're going to translate, we're going to synthesize, and we're going to disseminate what we learn, so that the whole of what we learn is greater than the sum of its parts, and it gets into the hands of those who can best put it to use. We're also going to be doing some field building. Beyond making grants, we want to bring people together around the shared research agenda at the intersection of pre-K-12 education and economic mobility. When we go to academic conferences a few years from now, we want to see multiple whole panels on this topic in a way that we don't see today. And in terms of the substance of the work that we're going to support, there's sort of three core buckets. The first two are the two big buckets of our first RFP. And so first, that's developing and strengthening measures of pre-K-12 skills and competencies that are likely to drive upward mobility. We'll talk in more detail about that in a moment. Two is to identify existing measures of pre-K-12 skills and competencies that drive upward mobility by connecting data. Also talk about that a little more later in the presentation. And we also want to make sure that the relevant cross-sector data assets are available. We know that it's not by any means simple to follow kids from when they're students in pre-K-12 through adulthood when they experience or don't upward mobility. And so if we can make some investments to do some data linking and just once again to support field building through better data, that's something that we want to do, not through this RFP, but we'll talk about how in a bit. So it's a very high level overview of the initiative. This set of friendly faces are the awesome team, the folks I'm very privileged to work with every day on this initiative. And so wanted to give you a sense of who they are, make sure you see that there's a lot of us thinking about this, working behind the scenes. And you may interact with some of us individually here and again as you go through this process. But the best way to communicate with us is through the SUMI, SUMI@urban.org email address that we'll have on a later slide. We also have a fabulous advisory council across a broad array of disciplines who have helped us improve the RFP already. Their fingerprints are already on this initiative. They'll also be advising us on grant making strategy and really help us think about the full portfolio of grants we make, because we want to once again fund a body of research where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So we're grateful for that advisory council. There's also a broader SUMI family. I'm grateful to our funders, the Walton Family Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Joyce Foundation. Also want to note that this is a fiscally sponsored project of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. That means that while the urban team's providing the programmatic leadership, you'll mostly interact with us on the substance. The grants themselves will be made by Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. The grant agreements will be with them. And so if you move sort of into the full proposal, and especially if you're funded, that will become relevant to you. And finally, want to acknowledge the dozens of other stakeholders who shared their input and perspective over the last couple of years while we designed this initiative and continue to do so through engagement that our team does. And this is a range of folks, community members, policymakers, educators, advocates, parents. Their voices have all shaped this work and made it better. So before we get kind of too deep into this first RFP, I think there's some basic questions that I imagine you all have, which is, well, what do we mean by economic mobility, by upward mobility? And how are we thinking about this issue of how students and schools fit into broader systems and structures? So I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Karishma, to get more into the details there.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, we think that sharing a little bit more of some of the conceptual foundations related to how we think about how education can affect longer term mobility, how individuals exist in context, and how we define upward mobility are all useful to hold in your mind as we begin to share more of the details of the 2024 RFP. So that's what I'll walk us through here over the course of the next couple of slides, starting with the goal of economic mobility. So we'll start there and sort of make our way backward. SUMI embraces efforts to broaden the definition of upward mobility to be inclusive of, but not solely focused on, economic success. So borrowing from our urban colleagues who led the development of the upward mobility framework, we endorse this three-part definition wherein individuals coming from the lower end of the income distribution are able to attain economic success, power and autonomy, and dignity and belonging as adults. Well, now we know that UI data or credit bureau data may be most familiar when thinking about economic mobility and especially measuring economic mobility. But if folks have data around these other measures of power and dignity and belonging in adulthood, we're excited to think of them as positive measures of upward mobility as well. So we welcome that. As Matt said, SUMI is ultimately interested in identifying the K-12 drivers of mobility. We think of these as individual level skills and competencies that help students take the next step to getting the needed training and education and ultimately securing a good job, all while growing their sense of self and well-being. And we think of those skills and competencies as existing in these 5 categories you see here on the right of academic achievement, health and well-being, career preparation, social capital, and non-cognitive factors. The full RFP shares some non-comprehensive lists of skills and competencies in each of these categories, by the way, if you want to check those out. We distinguish skills and competencies from experiences and credentials. So, for example, we want to know what math skills set students up for future success, as opposed to knowing what math courses they should take, which is an important nuance, we think. We believe that once the field has a sense of those needed skills and competencies that drive upward mobility, it can then shift its gaze to the instruction, interventions, and structures that exist within schools and other spaces that help grow those skills and competencies. So our focus for this initiative is really on this bolded sort of 2/3 of this flow on the second bullet here. All that being said, we know that it's complicated. We know that skills and competencies are not always distinct from experiences and credentials, especially when we take a life course perspective like we do with this initiative. So we expect to learn with you all and evolve and nuance our thinking on this front as we go. We often say that economic mobility is an outcome that is experienced by an individual, but that's influenced by forces well beyond the individual's control. And that's especially true for individuals who are disproportionately exposed to forms of structural disadvantage that are deeply implicated in experiences of intergenerational immobility. We broadly call these forces beyond the level of the individual contextual factors, and we encourage and expect all proposals to engage with them to some degree. So these could be thought of in these sort of concentric circles in the categories of household, neighborhood, school system, et cetera. Contextual factors, you could also think of them outside the pre-K-12 time horizon that we're focused on, to think about birth through pre-K and what happens outside of beyond high school into post-secondary and further. Go. We think that there are at least 3 general ways in which contextual factors can shape student success in school and beyond, that we can organize our thinking in terms of. First, non-school factors outside of school, like housing instability and food insecurity, can shape students' readiness to learn. Second, contextual factors can affect schools and school systems' ability to function well for all students. So things like funding equity. And third, factors that affect the degree to which students see a return on their success in school, or factors that modify how success in school translates into long-term success. So segregation in a job market, for example, or in the hiring, discrimination in the hiring process. The RFP says more about contextual factors and all of these conceptual foundations that I've gone over, if you want a little bit more texture to chew on as you think things through. But for now, let me hand the mic back to Matt, who will apply some of these concepts as he walks through our 2024 funding priorities with some examples.
Great, thank you, Karishma. As I previewed earlier, there's two main categories in our 2024 RFP. The first one is focused on new and improved measures. And here we're looking to support research and development, really development of measures that have a clearly articulated conceptual link to economic mobility and that are measured, at least measurable in the pre-K-12 school environment. And that we have reasons to think, or even some empirical evidence that they're malleable in that environment. And these projects could explore a lot of different dimensions through measure development, things like content alignment, reliability, and malleability. You could create a totally brand new measure, or you might improve on an existing one. And throughout all these projects, we think it's very important to look at heterogeneity of findings by race, ethnicity, and gender so that we really understand how they work for different groups of students in different contexts. So just to give you an example here, and this is not meant to be necessarily the best potential project on measure development, but just to give you a little more of a concrete sense of how we're thinking about this, a potential example of a project that we think would be aligned with the initiative would be to develop a new measure of non-cognitive factors. For example, of higher order skills like teamwork using student interactions in a digital learning platform. And if you look at the research synthesis we put out there, we cite a number of papers by Angela Duckworth and some of her colleagues talking about how to develop measures of some of these non-cognitive factors, including some ideas for how to do that in a digital learning platform. So this is something that folks in the field have thought about and even done in some cases. And so this example could be a project, to do so. We could also imagine that it might not include just data from a digital learning platform. There might also be some survey measures that would be part of that work. The idea being that there's some things we can measure in surveys that we can't get out of the tech platform, but that tech platform might be lower cost and more useful for scaling. And so by merging those two data sets, we might learn something about, well, how do we use data on interactions from the digital learning platform to greatest effect? And so to give you a little bit, as we've signaled, it's really important for folks to integrate context in their proposals and in their projects. And so a few ways how you might do this in this sort of hypothetical proposed project. One is, as I mentioned on the previous slide, sort of disaggregating findings by race, ethnicity, and gender. But that we think that's necessary but not sufficient. We also want folks to engage in a structural discussion of those findings to sort of really probe and look at, to the extent the data will allow or existing research allows or other contextual information, help really understand why we see any different findings by characteristics like race, ethnicity, and gender. And then a particular way in which this hypothetical proposed project might engage with some contextual factors is to look at alignment between student and teacher reported evaluations of the same students' teamwork skills, and think about how that alignment differs by student factors, as well as student-teacher identity concordance, such as whether they're identified with the same race or ethnicity group. So that's an example of from our first bucket. Our second bucket thinks about existing measures of pre-K skills and competencies and measures that have been around long enough that we can connect them to economic mobility outcomes. And so one requirement here, of course, is upward mobility. And so you want to be able to connect data on students who are from economically disadvantaged backgrounds to data on their future economic success, so we can get some sense of whether they achieved mobility or not. These proposed projects could test new potential correlates or study correlates that measures of competencies that we already know are correlated with economic mobility, but kind of break that down further. Look at heterogeneity, look at different groups, look at contextual factors. We expect that most of this work will be correlational, but we're also open to funding causal work when that's possible. And once again, expect folks to really engage with context and talk a little bit more about that in an example on the next slide. So our hypothetical example project here is thinking about measures of math achievement, right? And so we know we've been testing students' math skills for a very long time. So let's say an applicant to the SUMI RFP has access to some really detailed data on math skills from the 1990s or 2000s, looking not just for scale scores on a fourth grade math test, but measures of different dimensions of math ability, whether it's simple numeracy or two-digit multiplication or trigonometry or calculus, or pick whatever it is, different dimensions of math skills, or maybe even item level data where they can be constructing new measures of math skills. And that data is long enough ago, and they have an opportunity to connect it to data on adult wages or other dimensions of economic mobility. And this would be an example of a project where you can connect those and run some of those correlations, both overall and for different groups of students. And so, once again, emphasis on integrating context. One way to sort of first thing to do here, but not the place to stop, is to look at how those correlations between different kinds of math skills and earnings vary by student race, ethnicity, and gender, and engaging in a structural discussion of those findings. And this could also be an opportunity to think about how some of these structural factors moderate the relationship between the different kinds of math skills and economic mobility, right? So maybe on average, you have a bit more math skills that pays off in the labor market. But if you live in a place where the labor market is highly segregated by occupation, or where people of color face particularly high levels of labor market discrimination, that could blunt that relationship, and that would be really important to know. And so that's just one way you could integrate context in a study like this. So those are the two main buckets of our RFP. Those are the two areas where we want to read your one paragraph pitches by April 10th and your mandatory LOIs by April 30th. But as I kind of teed up at the beginning, we also know that the ability to do this kind of work is going to be limited by the availability of longitudinal data sets that follow students from pre-K-12 education all the way into adulthood. And so we want to increase access to those kinds of linked data assets and the breadth of research and researchers who can engage with that kind of work. And so if data linking is a cost of your potential research project, you can include that in your project budget by all means. But if you're aware of opportunities to make sort of a bigger data infrastructure play, to maybe make a bigger investment that might make sense to support one research project, but could make sense if it would support 5, 10, or more research projects and really expand the field's capacity to do this kind of work at the intersection of education and economic mobility, we want to know about that. And we do have some resources set aside, not through this RFP, but we do have resources set aside to support that kind of data asset creation. And there's no formal process for that. Just please send us an email to either one of us directly or to sumi@urban.org if you have some ideas, and we're happy to follow up with those discussions. So that's a little bit about a separate funding mechanism, but the focus of our webinar today is really about these first two buckets in our 2024 RFP. And so I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Maggie, who's going to tell you how you go about applying for a grant.
Thanks, Matt. Next slide. So as Matt previewed, applications are open now, and we want to tell you a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of the budgets and details and all of that. So again, we'll be funding about $3 million in total awards during this year's RFP, and we'll note that we do plan to have another RFP in 2026, although the shape and form of that might look a little bit different. For each grant under this RFP, we have a range of budgets, as Matt mentioned, from $50,000 to $500,000 with a 15% indirect cost rate. So in the RFP, you'll see two different buckets of kind of budget categories. Those are really there to help us sort full proposals for those ones that are invited into kind of longer proposals and shorter proposals based on the budget. So in the small budget category, we have $50,000 to $150,000 budgets. And we imagine these will be projects that use existing data, might be pilot testing measures, or are conducting long-term follow-ups of earlier studies with new administrative data. In the larger category, which goes up to $500,000, we envision projects that collect original data, have mixed methods research, or might be connecting a lot of large-scale administrative data systems for the purposes of the research. Now, we want to make sure, though, within that, you hear that these are just suggestions. We want you to propose what you need for your study, and there'll be more justification later on in the process if you're invited, but propose what you need to get the work done with quality and in a timely fashion. We also want to just remind everyone, if you are interested in this grant program, you do have to submit a mandatory letter of inquiry by April 30th. We will be taking those and asking a smaller set of applicants to do the full proposals, which later on. Next slide. So as you can see, we launched about 2 weeks ago, and we're glad you're here with us today. Just as a note, the slide and the recording will be available on our webinars page after this webinar. As Matt said, also, we have about 2 weeks left for quick responses for email reactions. So we're already really excited about the ideas we're receiving and hope that it's an opportunity for folks to hear. Number one, if we don't think it's as in scope at all, we'll definitely tell you that, so you don't have to waste your time. But more likely, we will try to help you shape it into an exciting proposal by noting elements that seem really important from the RFP that we would love for you to speak to in the LOI. A note about the LOI, which is due 5 p.m. Eastern on April 30th, is this is a 3-page single-spaced LOI. We try to outline very clearly what we're looking for in the RFP. So you'll find a table with the questions we're looking for in each section, and suggested page kind of lengths for those answers. We also will want you to highlight how your proposal aligns with our values, which I'll speak to in just a little bit. After we receive those LOIs, the SUMI leadership team, which is myself, Karishma, and Matt, will be reviewing those LOIs and deciding on a smaller number very quickly. In about 2 weeks, we'll contact folks to invite larger proposals. Those invitations or those applicants who are invited will have about a month and a half to do the full proposal. Also, during that time period, we'll be meeting with those applicants to provide another round of feedback. The full proposals are a little bit longer, but hopefully not too onerous. They will be 6 pages for small budgets and 11 for large budgets, again, single spaced, and again, with detailed criteria in the RFP. For those proposals, both our leadership team and external reviewers we invite that really align to the subject matter will provide recommendations for these grants. And then we'll work with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors to send out award notifications by the end of August and hope the work will start in September. Next slide. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we're looking for in the application. Again, we have kind of detailed questions in those RFP tables, but we want to speak a little bit more to the values that we think should be present in any strong proposal. So first and foremost, we're looking for proposals that align with our initiative. And that's really focusing on areas of interest that were covered earlier, which is either developing new or improved measures of skills and competencies in the pre-K-12 environment that have a conceptual link to economic mobility, or analyzing how existing measures that the research teams are already comfortable with, how those measures of skills and competencies in the pre-K-12 environment relate to economic mobility. Across all of this, we really want to better understand how education drives economic mobility, especially for students from low-income families. We also want projects to be feasible. So especially for those of us who are not used to giving out money on our team, we're used to applying for it ourselves. So we'll be looking for things like a great team, a clear timeline, either data access or a plan to collect or obtain that data, and an understanding of the challenges your particular project faces and how you plan to overcome those. In addition to alignment with the initiative and feasibility, we want to think about individuals and context. So this really speaks to what Karishma covered earlier, that economic mobility, or Matt and Karishma covered, economic mobility is an outcome that individuals experience, and it also captures the reality of a person within their environment and the factors beyond their control. So this tension is not simple. I don't think there's one methodological solution to hold that together. We do provide a lot of resources about how we've thought about it, how we suggest you think about it in our RFP and the appendices, which is also all on our website. So again, we're interested to think about how teams can kind of hold together these contextual factors and systems, which might inform the development of students' skills and competencies, moderate relationships, or affect the measures themselves. And I think we really want to highlight this because at the end of the day, if we have a great set of research projects that shows us a list of skills and competencies that really matter for students' upward mobility, if those projects haven't considered how all of that is shaped by people's context, then we won't have really done a good job for the students we're trying to serve. National learnings. So we also know context and place matter. And we know with data access, a lot of the projects might be place-based or subnational in scope, and that is totally fine with us. We also are eager to hear about projects using more national data sets, or just have each team speak to really how their project might benefit students from other locations. We want to really increase our understanding of the education to economic mobility through a portfolio that represents students across the country. So we may end up doing that through a series of place-based projects or through a mix of some place-based and some national. Equity. We hope to increase the economic mobility of students most likely to be stuck in intergenerational poverty. So we need to think about the drivers there by race, ethnicity, gender, and other individual characteristics. And we expect at the bare minimum all studies to examine how and why findings vary by group. We hope you'll go farther than that, and I think we've spoken to that already. We're also committed to modeling equity ourselves and through this process by encouraging emerging scholars from minority serving institutions, scholars of color, and other scholars underrepresented in the social sciences to apply. Rigor, we expect all projects to adhere to field best practices and really have the quality to withstand peer review. We also want to note that we have an expansive view of who's equipped to contribute to knowledge creation and how that is done. So, for example, we welcome the appropriate uses of approaches such as community-based methods or participatory action research. And finally, interdisciplinary research. As our advisory council kind of models, this is a life course outcome that we're thinking about that really spans child development, education, employment, and other domains. It's complex and multidimensional. So we think studying it, especially with this systems lens on individual outcomes, really requires the perspectives and the methods from various fields. So we're really excited to be reaching out and hope to get applications from a wide range of fields such as sociology, psychology, economics, behavioral sciences, system sciences, and of course, education. The initiative will encourage teams of research reflecting these diverse specialties and expertise to apply, and hopefully some teams will model that themselves. And across these projects, we'll seek a complement of methods, both or quantitative, qualitative, and mixed or multi-method. So again, this competition is open with mandatory LOIs, and hope you and your colleagues will apply. So before we get to the Q&A, next slide, please, we'll just give one more reminder of what we're looking for. We've presented a lot of concepts to you today and pretty quickly, so want to get back to the roots of the projects we're looking for. So across the span of academic, non-cognitive, health and well-being, social capital, and career preparedness, we're looking for projects to either develop new or improved measures of skills and competencies, or generate evidence on how well one or more existing measures of these competencies are correlated with upward mobility. So in that first bucket, just a reminder that the measures must have a theoretical link to economic mobility, and we're eager for you to tell us what you think that is or show us what's already been established. We also want to make sure that these measures are measured currently or could be potentially measurable in the pre-K-12 school environment. We also want to think about bounding this about skills and competencies that are malleable within the school context. Within the second bucket, we want to also make sure folks have data for students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and that you can propose how you define and measure upward mobility. So maybe traditional measures such as UI data in terms of economic success. It may be something more creative, or maybe measures of power and autonomy, or a person's sense of dignity or belonging in their community. And for all of these projects, we need you to think about how students' context matters for them, both for the research design and the way you can interpret results. So with that, I will give you some next steps, and then we will dive into questions. Next slide. So you can see all of our full RFP and a lot of other resources that have already been linked on our website, studentupwardmobility.urban.org. I also want to highlight something we haven't had the chance to talk about much today there, which is our community photo blog. We talked with a range of really important stakeholders, students, parents, and teachers, who really told us what success means for them and directly shaped this RFP. So you can hear some of their stories, see pictures of some of those folks on our website, but you can also see directly how their voices informed this initiative through kind of a linked document there that shows you that. You can also sign up to stay up to date with us. So as we start doing more research translation and starting building this field of education to economic mobility scholars, this is not just for our grantees. We really want to kind of build a mass here of folks who are thinking about this from different angles. So please sign up there to be part of that community building. Of course, feel free to share this opportunity with colleagues. And we hope many of you will end up applying, and don't forget you have that opportunity to send us a one-paragraph idea within the next 2 weeks. For those of you dropping off now, which we hope many of you will stay, but we also have a event survey in the link, which will be helpful for us as this is our first time running a grant program as a team. So with that, I will stop sharing and we will get to Q&A. Great. So I'm going to start with some questions that were sent prior to the webinar. And I'll start with you, Matt. In states where wage data isn't easily accessible to researchers, what educational or other employment outcomes would you be most interested to see in a proposal?
That's a great question. And so Krishma talked about kind of the three-dimension frame for mobility that we use. And so we're not just interested in wages, we're also interested in things like job quality, dignity, autonomy, sense of belonging, and community. In instances where a researcher has an idea for a compelling potential driver of mobility, but can't measure mobility directly, if you have access to data that you think are really good proxies for mobility, we'd be interested in entertaining that. Of course, all else equal, we prefer direct measures of mobility. But let's say you know where students went to college and what degrees they got, and you have an idea for how to connect that to data on economic mobility and graduation rates at the college level, then we would be very open to you making that case to us, but the onus really will be on the applicant to make the case that the set of proposed proxies for mobility are sort of good enough for your purposes. And I said we'll be, I think, especially interested in that if on the other side of the equation, the pre-K-12 measures themselves are particularly innovative or exciting.
Thanks, Matt. Krishma, I'll have you take the next question, which is wondering if there's space for early childhood as an upward mobility indicator.
Yeah, so our SUMI's focus is really on that pre-K-12 window in a person's life. So we want the individual skill competency that's being studied, either measurement development or its association with mobility, to really fall in that time window. That being said, we could imagine factors relating to early childhood experiences as part of a consideration of those contextual factors, because we do acknowledge that time exists beyond pre-K-12, both before and after, and we should consider how it affects what's going on in pre-K-12. So it'd be more of a contextual consideration and not the focus, the foreground of the study.
Thanks. And I'll stick with you. To answer a question, to what extent will qualitative or mixed methods focused studies be given consideration?
Yeah, so I think you touched on this a bit, Maggie. We welcome qualitative or mixed methods studies. We really want the proposed methodology to make sense for the proposed question. Could easily imagine some questions in this area, in this intersection of education and mobility, that would benefit from a qualitative or mixed methods approach. For example, trying to understand some of those structural drivers and making meaning of potential relationship in the category 2 type of projects, or doing some qualitative work in the measurement development space could make sense as well. So those types of projects, those types of methodologies are certainly welcome, and we understand that the higher budgets they oftentimes necessitate are also going to be part of the fund. So should ask for the resourcing that is required to do the work well.
Thanks. There's a question, is there a preference for internal versus external researchers? And are there requirements for the principal researcher, such as level of education?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we're most interested in the alignment of the proposed work with our initiative and the ability of the team to get it done. And so I don't think we have a strong preference for internal versus external, or particular preferences around, having a set number. We, of course, want to look at the team and have some confidence that you have the ability to get the project done as you've proposed it. But we think great ideas and great work can come from a range of people and places, and so don't have specific requirements around years of experience or anything like that.
Great. And I'll take the next one. The question is, do applicants need to indicate that they've made agreement with schools or have a recruitment plan to collect data for the pilot study of the instrument? I'll say we wouldn't hate having that information. So if you have it, that's fantastic, but also recognize that at this stage, you may not have the data access or may not have the agreements in place to collect data if that's the case. So we just want to speak to that in terms of feasibility in the LOI, and know that for proposals we invite, we'll be asking for a lot more information there, such as letters of support or MOUs. But the more you can tell us about the probability of getting that data, the stronger in terms of feasibility, your study would be aligned. I'll also take the next one, which is, can we speak to how anticipating balancing projects with larger and smaller budgets in our funding? So we've received this question before. We do not have a set number of projects we're going to have in the large or small categories. A lot of that depends on what people propose. Obviously, we don't have unlimited funding, but we'll be balancing really a portfolio here, where we think about a whole portfolio of our work representing those values more than specific proposals being small or large. So again, propose what you need in terms of funding, but note that if we find the budget to be improbable in terms of our ability to support, but really like the idea, we'd likely come back to you and see if there's room on your end to negotiate that. Krishma, here's a hard question. It says, a phrase appears a few times, structural discussion of findings. Can you say a little bit more what we mean by that?
Yeah, definitely. This falls under the broad heading of, we want to understand how individuals exist in context. So while you might disaggregate your, model by race and get a sense of whether there's heterogeneity of effects, if you do find something, or even if you don't, we want to understand why that might be in terms of the structures. Those might be policies, practices, laws, rules, regulations, these kinds of things that influence the setting around the individual. So we want to really lift our attention to more than just an individual's outcomes to understand how factors beyond the individual level, might be this related to the school setting, could even be beyond the school setting, as we showed on that slide with the concentric circles, might fit in, so that we're moving beyond disparity analyses that sort of leave it at, well, here are some differences, make of it what you will. And we do say more on this in the RFP, in the appendix.
Thank you. Matt, question is, are applications from coalitions accepted? Would it be favorable to be working in coordination with an institution of higher education?
A great question. We expect a lot of projects will require a diverse set of team members who might not all be working together at one institution. And so we accept and encourage folks to collaborate in whatever way makes sense for the work. And so if that is a coalition of organizations working together, that's great. We expect a lot of proposals will come from institutions of higher education, but those aren't the only places where good R&D can happen. And so we don't really have a preference in terms of where the work comes from. Like I said, we're going to be looking at what's the proposed work, can we get it done, and then as Mag indicated, we're also going to be looking at cost and trying to get the best set of projects we can within the budget that we have. So those will be the main factors.
And we are fine with folks also subcontracting. So if one organization wants to be the lead applicant, but have subs for either researchers or partners or data or different things like that, we're open to any combination of that as long as we meet the eligibility requirements we've set out in the RFP. A great question that's close to my heart is there a template available for the LOI so we can prepare our responses offline? There's not, but literally every single question that you'll have in the LOI document is outlined in our RFP. So we outline whether it's just going to be responses that you'll have to type in, or if it's going to be one Word document. So we're hoping you can use that as a guide to prepare rather than having a template. And then you should be able to easily enter that and upload the document that is required in that form. It's a good question. Okay. Matt, would in-school programming from an outside organization collecting original data be a good fit for this? Thinking specifically of approaches to career readiness and skills that can help economic mobility.
In-school programming from an outside organization. I mean, I don't, like I said, we don't have strict requirements on where the data has to come from or who has to collect it. And so I think it really depends on the specifics. And so like I said, I think we really encourage whoever asked that question to send us a little bit more detail to sumi@urban.org. And we can give you some more specific guidance about potential fit and any advice as you think about preparing an LOI.
Great, and I'll keep with you, Matt. Will this research be used to expand the predictors for the upward mobility framework? It's a project run out of Urban by our colleagues.
Great question. And yeah, we're big fans of the upward mobility framework. And so there's no specific plan, right, to go from this in 18 months or whatever, 2 years, 3 years from now, to update the upward mobility metrics framework. But one way we do talk about this is as a bit of a deep dive into one set of mobility metrics. And of course, when you're developing things like the mobility metrics framework, you have to look at the available research. And it's certainly our hope that if one way that we can be successful is that the upward mobility metrics framework of 5 to 10 years from now will have a much stronger evidence base to draw on and be able to come up with a set of education measures that are more rooted in evidence that they drive upward mobility. So we definitely see them as conceptually connected.
Great. Krishma, there's a question. Are you interested in teacher upward mobility as it relates to representation?
So I think I'd want to know a little bit more about this question. But but I would encourage focus on those like two different types of projects that we're interested in: the measurement of individual skills and competencies that can be acquired in the pre-K-12 time horizon, and the connection of those skills and competencies to experiences of mobility beyond pre-K-12. So I think I'll leave it at that, with an interest in understanding a little bit more of what's meant by teacher upward mobility. So that's something to
Thanks.
be in touch with at our sumi@urban.org email address.
What would an example of a causal project in bucket 2 be? Most things that are measures are outcomes themselves, and so they're hard to independently manipulate without changing other factors too.
Great question. I think it is more challenging to come up with causal evidence. Ideally, you'd have 1,000 different interventions, and you'd run RCTs on all of them and measure their impacts on short-term outcomes and on long-term outcomes, and then look at the correlation between short-term impacts and long-term impacts. That's, I think, conceptually how I would think about how you'd get causal evidence on a driver of upward mobility. Now, of course, we don't expect anyone to propose to run 1,000 experiments. Would probably not be feasible, at least within our budgetary guidelines. And at the same time, if you were to just have one intervention, which would give you sort of one short-term estimate and one long-term estimate, that probably wouldn't be enough to give us a sense of, well, does this, is the outcome a driver of upward mobility? And so one example I'll offer that is familiar to me, as given my training largely as an economist, but there may be others as well, but is sort of the school value-added literature in economics. Lets you look at come up with plausibly causal estimates of an intervention, which is an individual school, but in the context of a district or a state, when you can have hundreds or thousands of individual schools. And so I think that's a context where if you had a longitudinal data set that lets you say, what's the impact of 1,000 different individual schools on a set of short-term outcomes, and then what's the impact of those same set of schools on a set of long-term outcomes, around economic mobility, you could then see how those two are related to each other, and see which were the outcomes or the measures of pre-K-12 skills and competencies where the school impacts on those were most predictive of the school level impacts on the longer term outcomes. Could also be some really interesting opportunities to bring in some school level contextual factors. You could also sort of imagine a backward version of that, where you measure impacts of individual schools on mobility, and then try and understand what's different about the schools that had larger impacts on mobility versus smaller impacts on mobility. And so this is an area where I'd encourage folks to read the research synthesis that Karishma and I wrote and published a couple of weeks ago, and we can put a link to that in the chat. It has a discussion of this particular example. So I don't think that's the only way you could get causal evidence here. Part of the reason for doing an RFP is we want to hear lots of ideas, but that's one example of what it might look like.
Great. And just to note that we are excited to receive proposals around causal research, but also very open to correlational research. So don't want to scare folks off thinking that it has to be a causal study. There's a question: are proposals coming directly from government agencies interested in engaging in research eligible? Yes, government agencies are definitely eligible. With your own research teams or external research partners, we don't have a preference there, and hope to receive some of those, especially given the level of data access. That might be a really great opportunity. Karishma, we may have already answered this slightly, but more directly. The question is, are you open to a project that collects original data, as it seems like proposed projects are only workable if you have access to a large data set?
Yes, we're definitely open to projects that collect original data. Some of the examples that we shared probably were like thinking about access to large existing data sets, which just probably reflects our personal sets of experience that have to do with analyzing more secondary data. But I think there are probably a host of projects that would make sense for original data collection. That's a little smaller in scope. We're not going to get, hundreds of thousands of observations or anything, but that there's still much value that can be added by taking a smaller sample size and asking some intentional questions. So yeah, primary data collection is welcome, and the resourcing needed to do so is also requests for that resourcing are also welcome.
Great, thanks. Matt, what is considered adulthood in the context of this project and longitudinal data?
Great question, and sorry it took me a minute to get to my mute button there. So adulthood, we leave the definition of that to the applicant. Obviously, there's a trade-off between it'd be lovely to have data on people's lifetime earnings through age 80, and as they sat on their deck in the final decades of their life, their reflections on their full life, but that would take a long time to get. We also know there's some evidence that earnings can really evolve over the course of people's 20s, but we're also not just interested in earnings. So we think it's incumbent on the applicant to make a case for, what measures do they have access to, and are those good enough for your purposes? So if you have earnings at age 24, you might acknowledge, well, it'd be better to have earnings at age 28, but here's why you think for your particular study, that's good enough. And of course, that's part of what we'll be evaluating when we look at proposals, whether we think you've made a convincing case that the set of measures you have is good enough for what you're trying to learn.
Great, thank you. Karishma, the RFP has a list of individual level factors across the 5 categories: academic, health, etc. Is this the best starting place if we're considering track 1 for developing new or adapting existing?
Yeah, I think it's a very reasonable place to start brainstorming, because it reflects our understanding of some of the leading contenders for potential drivers of economic mobility based on our scan of the literature, but it is not comprehensive. So you might see that there are things that come to mind for you that aren't on that list, which doesn't to say that it wouldn't be a valid thing to study. And direct you back to some of the requirements that we're really looking for in those type 1 studies, namely that these be things that are measured or measurable in the pre-K-12 school environment, that seem like they'd be malleable within the school context, and that have a clear conceptual linkage to economic mobility. And if you've got something that meets those criteria but that isn't on the list, then it's still viable and worth considering. Maybe we just accidentally left it out or weren't aware of it.
Great. So question, can community-based learning count, for example, not in school and through a community development organization and small nonprofits? So we are bounding this by things that can happen in the pre-K-12 environment. I will caveat that a couple of ways. One is which, if there are activities that might be done through community organizations in that environment, and you think, eventually schools could have a more direct route to shaping those skills and competencies, we'd be open to that. We are also open, if this is happening in some sort of specialized school, and so it's coming through other means, we'd be open to that as long as the learnings could be useful for other contexts. But we are not thinking about the activities that are happening really truly outside of the school in terms of developing these skills and competencies. So we'd encourage you to think, though, what are those skills and competencies that are being developed, and maybe are there ways that schools are also developing those and being creative by thinking of projects that way. With that, I think I need to close us out. There are a couple other questions here that we will definitely take note of. We will be updating our frequently asked questions page on our website with these next week, so keep an eye on that. We really, really thank you for your engagement. As a reminder, you can submit questions, project ideas, whether they're technical or more substantive, to SUMI, SUMI @urban.org. And we really, really look forward to seeing your applications and building this community of scholars. Thank you.